There's a very famous Bible verse that Christians love to quote in order to get their needs met by God. It's Philippians 4:19, and it says, it's Paul speaking, but he says, "For my God will supply all of your needs according to his riches and glory in Christ Jesus." In Christians love to quote this verse, and they should. It's proper because God is our source. I mean, Paul says that later in the book of Timothy at the end, when he's instructing people to not put their hope in riches, but to put their hope in God, who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. And Jesus taught this. It's all throughout the Bible that God is our source and he will meet our needs. So, if we look in the New Testament at the early church, we can see examples of how God was doing this. If we look in Acts 2 at the end, we see that all of the disciples, the early church, the first Christians, they were all voluntarily selling everything they had. Nobody even considered anything was their own. They all brought it all, and they were laying at the apostles' feet, and they were giving it to anyone who had need. Okay? So that was an example of God working with people. His love so impacted people, the love of Jesus himself, so impacted those people that they all came together and met everybody's needs. So that's a very real example of Philippians 4:19 taking place. Why? Because God likes to work through people. He can do it himself, and sometimes he does, and he did. But we see his favorite method of doing that is that Acts 2 method, okay? We see it also again in 2 Corinthians 8, where Paul talks about the Macedonian believers who were eager to participate in the support of the saints, right? They were begging Paul for the privilege of doing so, okay? Even though they themselves were having great struggles and they had deep poverty, they were begging for the opportunity to support other people of faith, okay? And we see it in other places throughout the New Testament. You can see it in the book of Philippians, in the same chapter, Philippians 4, when Paul talks about how the one set of believers were supporting another set, okay? He also talks about it in Corinthians, okay? I believe it's the end of 1 Corinthians, where he talks about one set of believers is supporting another set of believers. So this is a common theme throughout the New Testament. When people became new believers, they were so impacted with Jesus' love that they supported each other and nobody had any need. We even see this in that passage in 2 Corinthians 8. Paul says, well, there's equality. He says equality twice, right? So the people who had too much shared with the people who didn't have enough. And then when the tables were turned, these people, sometimes when they had too much, they shared with them, and vice versa, right? So the point I want to make is that Christian people always quote that verse, but the other half of it is God working through his people to fulfill it. This is the biblical model. This is how we see God working to fulfill Philippians 4:19, okay? So this is how Paul could say he's going to do it, because he was seeing it happen all around him, and he had seen it happen, right? And he was like, hey, this is working. We know this is God working through people. His love is so impacting us that we're all supporting each other. So I know he's going to do it. Okay? The problem in today's contemporary church is people quote that verse, but the second part does not. Almost never happens. Rarely happens. It does, but not much. The percentage is 90 and 10. 90% doesn't happen, 10% does. Ask me how I know. 40 years of Christian culture. Watched it over and over and over again. There's a few select people who choose to live that way. But the majority of people who claim Christ's name do not. It's just a fact. So this is why. Okay. First, I'm grateful to those people who do. Okay. There are those people who do. But the fact that the 90% don't, this is why there are so many Christian people who claim that verse and then their needs don't get met. Because the second half of the equation is not working. This is why. This is why there are thousands of Christian people, people of faith, living on the streets. Some of them dying, right? Many of them going hungry. Because the second half of the equation is not happening. Why? Because people aren't impacted with Jesus' love like they were back then. If they were, they'd be doing the same. This is also why many believers, people of faith, who want to start a ministry or some type of service to others, I don't like to use the term ministry, but it makes it simple to understand. So many people who want to do that cannot, because that equation is not happening. So until the second half of the equation starts to happen, then Philippians 4:19 will remain unfulfilled in many people's lives. Thank you and have a nice day.